Malithar the Unflinching was swift and brash, a blooded initiate of the warrior caste, and was currently doing his best to avoid having the flesh of his legs flayed by the claws of the creature crawling around in his lap. Next to him, one of the human biologists from the couple he had been hired to safeguard a likely unnecessary precaution given the tameness of the reports for the jungle world they were arriving at simply cooed. "Oh, look, he likes you." The persimmons were what humans called retired, but evidently the typical human leisure activities of relaxing under UV-rich starlight and using sticks to propel small balls into holes across strangely denuded hills were not sufficient to entertain them. Instead, they had sought to begin cataloging one of the countless worlds that contained plentiful, if non-sentient, life. The two humans had not been alone when they first met the warrior. Stiff and formal introductions were made over the incessant yapping and seemingly omnipresent racing around of a small, furred quadruped creature his studies on human culture and fauna identified as a dog, a common companion species for humans. Humans almost always had companion animals of some type or another. While he had heard some claim that humans were stronger than any other creature in the galaxy, in Malithar's eyes, their minuscule forms were clearly unsuited for feats of strength or toughness, and relying on another species to assist them did not improve the argument, despite some saying that it was difficult to raise a companion creature. He had heard of one or two accounts of his own kind keeping a companion creature not of their species, but it was rare, to say the least. Still, Malithar was hardly willing to admit either aloud or privately that he believed humans to be anything other than feeble and underwhelming. To prove to himself that the accolades of humans were overblown, he acquired a youngling Nightfang, a carnivore from his own homeworld, renowned for its strength and speed. It had hatched only a week or two before, but its sharp claws, jutting canines, and bulbous head were already making a violent impression upon his more tender, less scaled appendages. Mrs. Persimmon had then made cooing noises more typically associated with entertaining and soothing infants of their own kind. Much to Malithar's confusion and mild dismay, the Nightfang responded to the sounds, curling and winding itself across his legs, leaving new gouges and cuts in its wake. The adolescent hunter craned its neck to allow the human to scratch between the large spines present there. Next to her, the human's own companion animal, which they had named Katie, sniffed curiously, let out a little bark of excitement, and made a pouncing motion toward the Nightfang. Malithar braced for bloodshed, but instead, the Nightfang bounded over and began wrestling with the small dog. To his surprise, it then turned and allowed itself to be chased as well. "See? They're bonding," said Mrs. Persimmon. Mr. Persimmon looked on with a tight-lipped smile, but when Malithar had spoken to him a few days later, he had expressed concern about acquiring a new companion animal. "I just don't know if I could do this again," he'd said to Malithai a few days later. "It's all well and good right now, but keeping pets is the easy part." Malithar had already lost count of the small wounds he'd received from his Nightfang, whom he had named Malithar-Tiriuses, but whom Mrs. Persimmon had nicknamed Arties. Malithar could feel disbelief creeping into his voice as he told the elder biologist, "How in the name of the 5 moons is this easy?" He gestured toward a rucksack they had used the day before while cataloging plant species, which Katie had enthusiastically turned into a chew toy, dragging it, ripping it apart, and chewing the webbing until it was slimy and nearly unrecognizable. Mr. Persimmon chuckled and said, "Stuff like that can be replaced, but trust me, that's the easy part." Malithar the Unflinching was a little less brash and a little less swift as he chased behind Artie, trying to anticipate whether and where he would need to apply more neutralizing powder. The humans had done something called house training for Katie, teaching her to urinate and defecate outside so that the interior of the habitation module no longer smelled of slightly stale urea and sulfur compounds. There had still been a number of mishaps, including an unexpected and unwanted soiling of Malithar's ceremonial garb, which he kept neatly folded in a corner. However, now Katie would claw at the airlock when she needed to relieve herself, and apart from requiring extra vigilance near the module to avoid stepping in a defecation, accidents had almost entirely ceased. When he attempted to try the same for his own night fang, though, Malathar found the process far more taxing. Artie was undergoing a period of maturation, marked by increased energy, aggression, and a temporary yet exponential rise in the acid content of his excretions. Malathar's tall, compound ears swiveled as he heard the sound he had been dreading, the gentle hiss of acid reacting with something. He raced over to find Artie squatting defiantly next to his ceremonial garb, a puddle of lumpy, fluorescent green excretia bubbling merrily on the metal flooring and oozing perilously close to the textiles. Screeching in alarm, he grabbed Artie, ignoring the wiggling snarls and attempted jabs from the creature's spines, and raced to the airlock door. He popped it open, tossed the night fang out, and hurried back to clean up the mess before it melted through the compartment flooring. Luckily, his garb remained undamaged, just barely. When he returned to the airlock to dispose of the neutralized droppings, he was startled to find Artie sitting there with a wriggling invertebrate clamped in his jaws, proudly displaying it like a child after their first successful hunt. Mrs. Persimmon had emerged from the tree line, carrying a bundle of leaf clippings, and made an excited noise. "Looks like he brought you something." Malathar groaned in frustration and said, "Just drop it." To his surprise, for once Artie listened. Unfortunately, Malathar had neglected to close the airlock door first, and the invertebrate scuttled inside. Malathar followed, determined to find and expel the intruder. Artie screeched in excitement and bounded further in, followed by Katie. The three creatures collided with objects and each other several times as they scrambled to catch the tiny, terrified quarry until it ran out, terrified, between Mrs. Persimmon's legs. He did his best to ignore the fact she was clutching her side from laughing so hard. Malathar the Unflinching was a little less brash and a little less swift, his mind racing as he tried to figure out the best angle of attack as he ran. A decade had passed without much fanfare, but the Persimmons had noted occasional traces of a large apex predator on the planet, despite most of the flora and fauna being benign herbivores or small carnivores. About half a solar cycle ago, they had begun baiting and setting up cameras to capture an image of the creature, but the results were always fleeting. Blurry shots. The creature moved too swiftly and cautiously to be clearly captured. His hindgut had told Malathar at the time that actively attracting such a predator with bait would also bring it closer to their encampment. The humans insisted, however, and he calmed his concerns by thinking of it being instead an opportunity for combat. After all, he was a warrior, and the opportunity for physical battle against a truly worthy opponent was not one to shy away from. His people traditionally saw the warrior's path as striving and succeeding in conflict abstractly. But ever since Mr. Persimmon had introduced him to chess and soundly beaten him every time, Malathar had adjusted his interpretation of the warrior's philosophy to focus on physical combat only. Minutes earlier, a crashing in the brush had been followed by Mrs. Persimmon's scream. Artie had responded even faster than Malathar, streaking forward into the bushes. Malathar, loping behind, could hear the rustling crash of Artie's pursuit, the night fang's long legs allowing it to leap over fallen trees and evade venomous bramble vines. He also heard Mr. Persimmon shouting, "Delilah! Where are you?" and the frenzied barking of Katie, who sounded further ahead than her owner. Artie's shrieking growl mingled with Katie's frantic snarls, sounds Malathar had never heard from the normally cheerful dog. Pushing forward, he emerged into a clearing. At its center lay a broad pile of brambles and leaves, apparently pulled together to form a nest. Sitting atop it was the apex predator they had sought, a massive shelled creature with snapping claws and mandibles that chittered and gurgled. A pair of venomous stingers arced up from behind it, striking toward but not quite hitting the dog and the night fang. In one of its 4 claws hung Mrs. Persimmon, her gray curls streaked with blood as she dangled unconscious from its grasp. The enormous creature hissed, and Malathar quickly unfurled and armed his rifle, bringing it to bear. He sighted the creature carefully, avoiding the captured human. For a moment, he aimed at its center mass, but hesitated. He had only one shot, and he could not be certain how thick its shell might be. Instead, he quickly aimed for one of the exposed eye stalks and fired. The stalk exploded in a shower of purple gore, and the creature hissed and reeled, instinctively reaching for the injury and dropping Mrs. Persimmon roughly onto the ground. Immediately, Katie stood over her, barking and growling, while Artie leapt forward, snapping and shrieking. The Night Fang dodged the predator's attempts to strike with its stingers until the creature finally withdrew, crashing off into the brush. Behind him, Malithar heard Mr. Persimmon running up, wheezing and out of breath. The man stumbled forward and knelt beside his wife, clutching her hand. "Oh, God, Delilah," he choked out, voice trembling. "Please wake up. Say something, say anything." Malithar felt his own shoulders sag with relief as she coughed and gripped her husband's hand. "Don't worry, old coot," she rasped. "I'm still here." Mr. Persimmon laughed shakily. "God, Delilah, don't scare me like that. My old ticker's not going to last if you keep doing this." She smiled weakly and rubbed Katie's gray-tinged muzzle. The dog nuzzled her, licking her face. Malithar couldn't help the grin forming on his own face, a learned expression from his years with the humans. Artie returned, curling against Malithar's legs, but carefully avoiding puncturing him with its spines. Malithar glanced in the direction the predator had fled, then looked down at the Night Fang. He marveled that both the creature and Katie had escaped injury. "How in the stars' names do you make sure they're okay?" he asked, when they're willing to dive into danger like that. Mr. Persimmon laughed. "You can't. You just have to hope for the best. Besides, like I told you before, keeping pets is the easy part." Malithar snorted in disagreement but said nothing, stepping forward to help support Mr. Persimmon as they headed back home. Malithar the Unflinching was a little less brash and a little less swift as he carefully steeped a cup of tea for Mrs. Persimmon. Her health had never fully recovered after the injury, especially as her leg had to be amputated below the knee due to the predator's claws. So far, the shot to its eye had apparently driven all curiosity and interest out of the predator. No trace of it had been captured on the cameras since, but that was far from Malithar's or Mr. Persimmon's mind now. Mr. Persimmon rarely left her side, staying near constantly. When she slept, he would trudge through the planet's jungle despite it being the rainy season, braving the swampy trails to collect blooming flowers he knew she enjoyed. Malithar often joined him, but recently he had asked to go alone, though Artie always accompanied him. Katie remained by Mrs. Persimmon's bed, her head perpetually nudged under the woman's hand. Her tail wagged whenever Mrs. Persimmon stirred enough to feel the fur beneath her fingers and give a few gentle scratches. Malithar finished the tea and set the steaming cup by her bedside. Her breathing had grown shallow and quick. Despite his gentle calls, she did not awaken. Mr. Persimmon came in, shaking off his poncho and swapping out the small cup, holding the previous bouquet with a fresh one. As he placed the flowers aside, he caught sight of her and sat heavily, letting out a deep sigh. Taking her hand in his, he whispered, "It's all right, Flower. You don't need to hold on for me. Go on, be at peace. The good Lord's got a place set out for you." He turned to Malithar. "It won't be long now. I know she's grateful for all you've done for us." Malithar nodded silently and made for the door. He stepped outside, ignoring Mr. Persimmon's call behind him. "Hey, Malithar, wait, you should." The airlock door shut and he began running. He dashed through the trees and rain, focusing on the trail underfoot, trying to think of anything to distract himself from what he was leaving behind and what he knew was about to happen. Behind him, Katie's mournful howl echoed through the woods. He fell to his knees, overcome by grief, letting it take him for a time. Hours later, Malithar returned to the module. Mr. Persimmon had already wrapped his wife in a sheet and stood, with 2 shovels leaning by the door. His expression was heavy with anger, not just at the world or the loss of his wife, but directed specifically at Malithar. "Where were you?" Mr. Persimmon demanded. Malithar blinked in surprise, unaccustomed to harsh words from the human. Mr. Persimmon cut him off with a sharp wave and pointed toward Artie. The Night Fang was curled around Katie at the foot of the bed, where Mrs. Persimmon's body lay. "You left your damn companion here alone and afraid in a room with death." He stepped closer, glaring up at the alien. This creature, who has only known you as its sole guardian and parent since nearly the day it was born, was frantic, calling and clawing at the door for you. Malithar glanced over, seeing fresh gouges in the metal frame, before his attention was snapped back by Mr. Persimmon jabbing a finger beneath his slitted nose. Promise me you will never ever leave a pet alone with death ever again. Process your grief however you damn well need to, but make sure you are there for them. Understood? Wordlessly, Malithar nodded. Mr. Persimmon seemed satisfied and stepped back, thrusting the shovel toward him. Here. Help me dig a plot for Delilah. No sense in waiting until the weather gets worse. Malithar the Unflinching was a little less brash and a little less swift as he followed Artie's signs of concern. Where is she, boy? Find her! He trailed behind the Night Fang, who loped through the dense foliage, stopping occasionally to sniff and paw at the ground. Katie had gone out earlier but hadn't returned, and both he and Mr. Persimmon were growing worried. She had slowed over the past year, her steps less steady. Recently, she had stumbled and fallen on trails she once navigated with ease. Suddenly, Malithar spotted what at first seemed to be a pile of leaves. It shivered and whined as Artie nuzzled it, careful not to poke the dog with his large front fangs. Carefully, Malithar scooped Katie into his arms. Despite his strength, she still felt impossibly light, her body growing gaunt in the years following Mrs. Persimmon's passing. Carefully cradling Katie, Malithar ran back toward the habitation module. He spotted Mr. Persimmon on the porch, anxiously wringing his hands. They hurried inside and Mr. Persimmon grabbed a towel to dry Katie's soaked fur. Artie scurried to the corner they shared, pulling out a small, squeaky toy shaped like a carnivore the Persimmons had called a bear. He brought it over, resting it beside Katie's head, then nudged it closer to her. Katie looked at the toy, then slowly lifted her head. She gave a long, tired glance at both Mr. Persimmon and Malithar before gently taking the toy in her mouth and biting it enough to emit a single, quiet squeak. The sound caused Artie to let out an excited shriek, bounding in a circle around them before settling behind Mr. Persimmon. Katie rested on Mr. Persimmon's lap as Artie curled up close. The room fell silent, save for Katie's labored panting, the sound of their breathing, and Artie's occasional whines of concern. After a long moment, Mr. Persimmon blinked away tears and muttered hoarsely, Damn it! Damn it, Delilah! I told her this was a bad idea. I told her. Malithar tilted his head in confusion. What do you mean? From the start, Mr. Persimmon replied. I told her we were too old to be getting a new dog. His voice cracked. I told her this would be the last one. I can't do this again. Malithar nodded solemnly. But by God, I wish I could, Mr. Persimmon continued, his voice heavy with grief. But I'm too old. My bones are tired. It's too late now anyhow. His voice softened to a near whisper, one Malithar suspected he wasn't meant to hear. If I lose Katie, Katie's the last part of her I have left. I can't lose her too. Katie must have recognized her name. She lifted her head weakly, licking Mr. Persimmon's hand a couple of times. He scowled and smiled, rubbing the back of his hand over his eyes as he gently scolded, Hush now. Stay still, girl. You'll be okay. You'll be okay. Katie convulsed in his arms, a pained whine escaping her, mirrored by an echoed shriek of distress from Artie. Mr. Persimmon's voice turned hoarse. Malithar, he said, struggling to keep steady. Go get the medical kit. Find the vial marked morphine and fill a syringe for me. Would you? Malithar nodded, but he paused as he was not familiar with the amount they had used before when the humans or dog had been injured. What dosage should I prepare to ease her pain? Mr. Persimmon looked up, meeting Malithar's gaze with red, wet eyes. His voice broke as he replied, Just fill the damn syringe, please. Without hesitation, Malithar stood and strode to the cabinet. He rifled through the medical pouch until he found the bottle Mr. Persimmon had requested. He quickly drew the morphine into the syringe, filling it until the bottle was nearly empty. He tapped the side to clear the air bubbles, just as he had seen Mrs. Persimmon do many times before. But as he turned back, the atmosphere in the room shifted. A soft, broken sigh escaped Mr. Persimmon, and Artie let out a low, mournful whine. Malithar came around the corner and looked at Katie, who was breathing out, but her chest did not move again to breathe in, and she went still. "Go on, girl," Mr. Persimmon whispered. "She left the gate open for us. Go give my flower a kiss and play with Abigail for me. Tell them all how much I miss them. I'll see you all soon." Malithar stood silently, placing a hand gently on Mr. Persimmon's shoulder. The man reached up, patting it with trembling fingers. Artie approached Katie, nuzzling her still head before walking over to Malithar, rubbing against his legs. Malithar crouched and scratched the Night Fang's head, feeling the vibrations of its purring whine beneath his hand. Mr. Persimmon watched the interaction, then reached out to pet Artie as well. He barely flinched when a sudden twist of Artie's head jabbed his hand. Lowering his gaze, he resumed stroking Katie's quiet form. With a rueful smile, he looked at the syringe in Malithar's hand and shrugged. "She always did like doing things her way," he said, blinking through tears. Malithar the Unflinching was a little less brash and a little less swift as he folded his ceremonial robes. Together, they had buried Katie in a patch of native flowers, right beside where Mrs. Persimmon was interred. The habitation module was nearly empty now, its contents packed away, save for the small trinkets and keepsakes left around the two graves. "They'll have more use for it than I do," Mr. Persimmon had said about the possessions they left behind. As they prepared to leave, Malithar turned to Mr. Persimmon. "Where are you off to next?" he asked. With a shrug, the human said, "Don't know. Don't really care, to be honest. I just feel like I need to wander until my legs can't carry me anymore." His gaze lifted to meet Malithar's. "Don't get old, son. Everything around you dies." He reached for the locket that had hung around his neck for as long as Malithar had known him. Opening it, he revealed its contents to Malithar for the first time: 3 locks of hair. One was a gray curl from Mrs. Persimmon. Another, black and brown, belonged to Katie. The third were delicate, tiny silken curls from someone Malithar had never met. Holding the locket reverently, Mr. Persimmon said softly, "I'll need to find a good spot to spread them. Somewhere with a view of something other than just trees," he said, smiling as they both looked around at the beauty of the rain blossoms that were blooming all along the trunks of the trees nearby. He smiled faintly. Delilah was always the botanist. Coming here was her idea in the first place. Malithar nodded as Artie whined, nudging his hand for attention. He bent over to grab and throw a stick for Artie to fetch, and the Night Fang let out a screech of delight as it bounded forward after the branch. "It's amazing how they can move on from grief so easily," Malithar said, watching the Night Fang leap joyfully in the light morning rain. Mr. Persimmon reached up and patted Malithar's arm gently. "That's what I've been telling you all along, son. Keeping pets truly is the easy part." Malithar the Unflinching was a little less brash and a little less swift these days, but his patience had grown immeasurably. He sat at a spaceport he'd already forgotten the name of, nursing a drink. Nearby, loud laughter and the sound of boastful arguments caught his attention. "I'm telling you, humans are overrated," one voice bellowed. "They can't even lift half a ton. They go down just like anyone else to a laser bolt. Sure, they might run a while, but they're unarmored, fleshy, pink, and it took them centuries to even stop killing themselves before they figured out space travel." Malithar's grip on his metal cup tightened, the faint sound of crinkling metal betraying his growing irritation. He took a slow breath, calming himself in a way he'd never have managed years ago. Rising to his feet, he stepped over to the table. The trio fell quiet as he approached, but the most vocal of the group snorted, laughing and pointing a long, clawed finger. "Oh, you've got something to say, old-timer?" Malithar's fist came down hard on the table, silencing the remaining chuckles. "You have no idea," he said evenly, meeting the speaker's eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" one of the others asked, glancing nervously at Malithar's towering frame. "You're right," Malithar said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "Humans aren't the strongest or the fastest, or even the toughest. The three he was speaking to appeared taken aback by his agreement. Wait, what? So humans aren't special? He gestured toward the bustling spaceport outside the bar. A young, red-haired human walked by with a winged serpent coiled around his shoulders. The man laughed, feeding the creature a piece of meat while affectionately scratching under its chin. That, Malithar said, pointing at the scene, is what makes humans special. It's not their strength or speed, it's their connection to their companions. A species so weak they need to rely on other species to obey them? One of the trio sneered. Doesn't seem that special. And it definitely doesn't seem that hard to raise a critter and have it follow you around. Malithar chuckled darkly, his laughter carrying a bitter edge that silenced the group. He reached under his tunic and pulled out a chain he always wore. Hanging from it was a single, long, curled night-fang tooth, its edges worn smooth from years of being carried close to his chest. That's the thing you don't understand, Malithar said, his voice tight with memories. Keeping a pet is easy. But letting them go? That's the hard part.